My name is Sadie, and for 22 years, my world has been made of paper and silence. I'm the head librarian in Oakhaven, a town that has slowly been strangled by the ambition of one man, Mayor Richard Thompson. He's a man who wears expensive suits that are always just a little too tight in the shoulders, a man whose smile never ever reaches his eyes. To him, my library, the Oakhaven Public Library, wasn't a sanctuary of knowledge or a pillar of the community. It was a line item in a budget, a festering wound of what he called fiscal irresponsibility. He saw us as obsolete, a relic, and he'd been trying to kill us for years. He finally thought he had the perfect weapon, a public execution disguised as bureaucratic procedure. He stood at the podium during the last town hall meeting, the microphone squealing in protest as he leaned too close. He called the library a drain, a luxury our town could no longer afford in these lean times. He himself had engineered. Then he looked directly at me, sitting in the third row, and delivered the killing blow with a politician's smirk. He was demanding a full, comprehensive audit of the library's most valuable assets. Not the new computers we'd fought for, not the children's reading program I'd built from scratch. He wanted an audit of our historical town records, the archives. A ripple of confusion went through the room. The archives were a dusty, forgotten collection in the library's climate-controlled basement. To everyone else, it was a room full of crumbling leather and yellowed paper. It was the least used, most expensive part of the library to maintain. It was the perfect evidence for his argument. He was forcing me to document my own obsolescence, to spend weeks compiling a report that would prove his point, a report that would be the final nail in my library's coffin. He thought he was clever. He thought he was cornering me, forcing me to hand him the very justification he needed to padlock our doors forever. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that he hadn't just handed me a shovel to dig my own grave. He had handed me a key to a story he'd spent his entire life trying to keep buried, because I am the only person left alive who knows how to read the archivist's code. And deep within those obsolete records, tucked away in a language of secret symbols and invisible ink, was the truth, the proof that his family's immense wealth, the very foundation of their power, was built on a crime, a theft against the very people, the very community. He was now so eager to disenfranchise. He wanted an audit. I decided then and there, under the buzzing fluorescent lights of that soulless town hall, that I would give him the most thorough, the most honest, and the most devastating audit he could have ever imagined. If you've ever had your life's work, your passion, dismissed as worthless by someone who refuses to understand its value, let me know in the comments below. It really does help to know that you're not screaming into the void. That night, the library was a tomb. The heavy oak doors were locked. The closed sign turned to the empty street. The only sound was the gentle hum of the ventilation system and the frantic, angry thumping of my own heart. I walked past the rows of sleeping books, their spines like soldiers in silent formation, and went down the narrow staircase to the basement, to the archives. I keyed in the code and the heavy steel door hissed open, revealing the cold, dry air of the vault. It smelled of time, of leather, paper, and a faint, almost floral scent of decaying ink. This room was my sanctuary. It was the heart of the library, the town's memory, its conscience, and he wanted to rip it out. I sank into the worn leather chair at the central reading table, the single pool of light from the desk lamp illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The weight of it all pressed down on me, the public humiliation, the smug, triumphant look on Thompson's face, the weary faces of my staff who were now facing unemployment. For a moment, I felt a crushing wave of despair. He was going to win. He had all the power, all the money, all the influence. I was just a librarian, a keeper of stories nobody seemed to want anymore. My hands were shaking. I rested my forehead on the cool, smooth wood of the table and just breathed in, out. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. My mind drifted back. It always did in this room. It drifted back to him, to Mr. Abernathy. Elias Abernathy had been the town archivist for 50 years before me. He was a creature of the archives, as much a part of this room as the shelves and the books themselves. He always wore the same dusty tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, and his fingers were permanently stained with the faint blue of archival ink. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, as if he were afraid a sudden motion might startle the ghosts that lived in the paper. He saw history, not as a collection of facts, but as a living, breathing thing, a story that was always being told, whether anyone was listening or not. He hired me straight out of college. I was a history major with a passion for primary sources, and to him, I wasn't just an assistant, I was an apprentice. He taught me how to handle brittle documents, how to mend a broken spine, how to identify the subtle differences between 19th century rag paper and early 20th century wood pulp. But the real lessons, the important ones, were taught in whispers after the library was closed and the silence settled in. He taught me his system. It wasn't just a code. To call it a code was like calling a cathedral a shed. It was a language, a complex, multi-layered system of annotation he had developed over decades. He called it the grammar of truth. It was a way of embedding the real story, the one that happened between the lines of the official record, directly into the documents themselves. A tiny, almost invisible glyph in the margin of a deed might indicate the signature was made under duress. The specific chemical composition of the ink he used for a footnote, only visible under a certain wavelength of ultraviolet light, could link a seemingly innocent land sale to a backroom deal recorded in a different ledger a decade later. A dog-eared corner on a specific page, when cross-referenced with his private journals, could reveal a witness's secret testimony. It was madness. It was genius. It was his life's work. He created it, he said, to protect the town's memory from men with loud voices and short memories, men like Mayor Thompson's grandfather, men he knew, like Mayor Thompson himself. The Thompsons had run Oakhaven for 3 generations. They weren't just politicians. They were the town's royalty. They owned the old mill, the vast tracts of land on the west side of the river, the largest houses on the highest hill. Richard Thompson had inherited the mayoral seat like it was a family heirloom, and from the very beginning, he'd had it in for the library. His war wasn't a sudden thing. It was a slow, grinding siege. The first year he was in office, he cut our acquisitions budget by 40%, claiming we could rely on interlibrary loans. The next year, he vetoed a grant I had secured for a literacy program for at-risk youth, calling it a social experiment the town couldn't afford. He'd show up at fundraisers and talk loudly about the coming digital revolution and how physical books were a charming but unsustainable anachronism. I never understood the depth of his animosity. It felt personal, pathological. He seemed offended by the very existence of a place that operated on principles other than profit and power, a place that offered knowledge for free, a place that held the past immovable and unchangeable, a place that was, in its very essence, a check on the kind of man he was. He wanted to be the sole author of Oakhaven's story, and he couldn't do that, while our shelves held the unedited drafts. I remembered the last time I saw Mr. Abernathy. He was in a nursing home, the scent of antiseptic fighting a losing battle with the smell of old age. The tweed jacket was gone, replaced by a thin cotton gown. His hands, once so steady and precise, trembled as he held my own. The ink stains on his fingers had finally faded. He made me lean in close, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He told me, "Sadie, you are the guardian now, the guardian of the grammar." He didn't have to explain what he meant. He said, "Don't go looking for dragons, but if a dragon ever comes to your door, you'll know where the swords are buried." He squeezed my hand, a flicker of the old fire in his pale blue eyes. "Promise me you'll protect the stories, Sadie, especially the quietest ones." I promised, and for years I had kept that promise by simply maintaining the archives, by being a silent, passive guardian. I had the keys to the kingdom, but I never dared to use them. It felt wrong, like a betrayal of his trust. He had built a shield, not a weapon. To use his work for a personal vendetta against Thompson felt like a violation of his memory. That was the reason I'd given myself for years. It was a good, noble reason, but sitting there, in the cold silence of the vault, I had to admit to a deeper, less noble truth. I was also afraid of the power of it, afraid of what would happen if I unleashed it, afraid of Mayor Thompson. But tonight, that fear was gone. It had been burned away by the bright, hot flame of his arrogance. He hadn't just come to my door. He had kicked it down. He was trying to burn the whole house down with me inside it. My promise to Mr. Abernathy wasn't just to protect the archives as a physical place. It was to protect the truth within them. And right now, that truth was under direct attack. My despair hardened. It cooled and compressed into something dense and heavy. Something that felt like resolve. I stood up, the chair scraping against the concrete floor. My gaze fell upon a particular shelf, the one holding Mr. Abernathy's private reference collection. There, tucked between a text on 18th century calligraphy and a treatise on paper preservation, was a thick, unassuming volume bound in dark green leather. It had no title on its spine. It was his master key, his index. I pulled it from the shelf. The leather was cool and smooth beneath my fingers. I carried it back to the desk and opened it. The first page was blank, save for a single handwritten sentence in his familiar, elegant script. The loudest lies are often built on the quietest thefts. Thompson wanted an audit. Fine. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. This wasn't about saving my job anymore. It wasn't even about saving the library. This was about honoring my promise. This was about the quietest story of all. It wasn't about revenge. I told myself that over and over again. It was about setting the record straight. But as I flipped to the first coded entry in Abernathy's index, a cold, sharp satisfaction settled deep in my bones, and it felt an awful lot like the beginning of a war. The work began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a hunt. The mayor's audit demanded a full inventory and valuation of assets, a boring bureaucratic task. On the surface, that's exactly what I was doing. I started creating spreadsheets. I listed acquisition dates, preservation costs, insurance valuations. I was building the perfect mundane shell for the explosive core I was assembling inside. My first real move was to isolate the time period. The Thompson family's rise to prominence began in the late 1920s. Mayor Thompson's great-grandfather, a man named Jedediah Thompson, had arrived in Oakhaven with very little, and within a decade, had become the largest landowner in the county. The official story, the one repeated in the town's cheerful, sanitized centennial book, was that he was a brilliant entrepreneur who saw potential where others saw only swamp and rock. He bought up cheap, unproductive land, and through sheer grit, made it valuable. Mr. Abernathy's grammar told a different tale. Unearthing it was a meticulous, painstaking process. It was an archaeological dig into paper and ink. My nights were spent under the single lamp in the archives, the world outside ceasing to exist. I had Abernathy's index, my Rosetta Stone, but it was no simple cipher. It pointed me toward other documents, creating a web of cross-references. A tiny, almost invisible drawing of a willow tree in the margin of a 1928 tax ledger would lead me to a specific page in a book of local botanical prints from 1910. On that page, a faint indentation, only visible when lit from the side, would give me a date. That date would lead me to a specific box of correspondence from the town clerk. It was a treasure map, and Mr. Abernathy had drawn it over the course of 50 years. Slowly, the real story of Jedediah Thompson began to emerge from the fog of history. He wasn't an entrepreneur. He was a predator. His target was a small, thriving community known as Miller's Hollow. It doesn't exist anymore. If you look at a map of Oakhaven today, the area is a large, placid body of water called Thompson Reservoir, a beautiful lake surrounded by the sprawling, manicured lawns of the Thompson mayoral estate. The Centennial Book calls the creation of the reservoir a feat of civic engineering that brought prosperity and recreation to the town. The archives told me that Miller's Hollow was a community of about 30 families, mostly farmers and craftsmen. They weren't wealthy, but they were self-sufficient. They owned their land outright, passed down through generations. It was a pocket of Oakhaven that ran on its own terms, and as I delved deeper, I discovered something that made my breath catch in my throat. I found a faded photograph, tucked into the back of a municipal planning folder, unlabeled. It showed a group of people at a summer picnic. In the background, a man with a shock of white hair and familiar pale blue eyes was smiling. It was a young Elias Abernathy, and the caption, written in his own coded script on the back, read, "Home, Miller's Hollow, 1925. This wasn't just history for him, it was his history, his home. The records showed that in 1929, the state passed a bill allowing for the creation of reservoirs for public good. Jedediah Thompson, who had somehow gotten himself appointed to the Regional Water Commission, immediately proposed the flooding of Miller's Hollow. The plan was presented as a necessity, a way to provide water for the growing town, and power from a new hydroelectric dam. The families of Miller's Hollow were offered buyouts for their land. The official records, the pristine deeds stored in the town clerk's office, showed that every single family sold willingly, for a fair market price. But the archives told the truth. In the margins of the official town council meeting minutes from that period, Abernathy's annotations began to appear like a rash. A symbol I learned meant coercion appeared next to the name of every single Miller's Hollow resident who spoke in favor of the sale. Using a special UV pen he'd designed, I found invisible notes written between the lines. They were fragments of testimony. One read, "Jedediah's men visited my wife, told her the children might have an accident on the way to school." Another, "They dammed the creek upstream, flooded my fields 2 weeks before the vote, told me it was an act of God." He was documenting a campaign of terror, conducted in whispers and shadows. The deeds themselves were the masterwork. I took them to my workstation, a corner of the archive equipped with magnifiers and specialized lights. The signatures all looked legitimate, but Abernathy's index pointed me to a specific detail, the ink. He had included a small coded chemistry guide in his reference book. Following his instructions, I tested a microscopic sample from one of the signatures. It was a standard iron gall ink of the period. But when I analyzed the signature of the county clerk who notarized the deeds, the ink had a trace amount of a specific cobalt compound, a compound that, according to Abernathy's notes, was only used by one law firm in the entire state at that time, the law firm that had Jedediah Thompson on retainer. The clerk's signature was a forgery, applied long after the original deeds were signed, likely on blank or fraudulently obtained pages. It was a systematic, brutal, and legally brilliant swindle. This was the original sin of the Thompson family. Their dynasty was built on a drowned town. Their wealth was watered by the tears of 30 displaced families. And Mr. Abernathy, a child of that drowned town, had spent his entire life creating an indestructible monument to that truth. I knew this was dynamite, but I also knew that historical documents, however damning, could be dismissed. Thompson would call them the ramblings of a bitter old man. He'd use his power and his lawyers to bury me and the story in endless litigation and public relations spin. I needed more. I needed a bridge between the past and the present. I needed an ally. My first thought was Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was a senior clerk in the town records office, a woman in her late 40s who had the perpetually tired look of someone who had seen too much bureaucratic nonsense. She was sharp, discreet, and she despised Mayor Thompson with a quiet, burning passion. A few years ago, her son had needed help with a complicated genealogy project for school. He wanted to trace his family back to the town's founding. The library's online resources were a dead end, so I had taken him down into the archives myself, spending a Saturday afternoon showing him how to read old census records and property maps. Eleanor had never forgotten it. She saw the library not as a building, but as a service, as me. I called her. I didn't mention the Thompsons or Miller's Hollow. I was cautious. I just said, "Eleanor, it's Sadie. I'm working on the mayor's audit. I need to verify the provenance of some older deeds from the 1920s and 30s. I need to see the originals held in your vault, not just the copies we have." There was a pause on the line. Then, his audit? That son of a... Of course, Sadie. When? It has to be quiet, Eleanor. After hours. My favorite time to work, she said, a hint of steel in her voice. The rats are all at home. Meet me at the back entrance of Town Hall at 9 tonight. That night, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit basement of Town Hall, Eleanor pulled the heavy bound volumes of the original county deeds. She laid them on a table, her expression grim. "He's been sniffing around these records too," she said in a low voice. "Had his assistant pull the master index last week. said he was looking for something for a historical display. I think he was making sure his story was straight. This sent a chill down my spine. He was arrogant, but not stupid. He was checking his defenses. I opened the volume for 1929. The pages were crisp, official, and there they were, the deeds from Miller's Hollow. They looked perfect. But with Eleanor's help, I was able to access the corresponding notary logs. We found the clerk, whose name appeared on the deeds. According to the log, on the day he supposedly notarized 30 separate land sales for Miller's Hollow, his logbook showed he was in the state capital, 100 miles away, testifying in an unrelated case. The alibi was ironclad. The forgeries weren't just a theory anymore. They were a provable fact. Eleanor's face was pale in the harsh light. "My God, Sadie," she whispered. "This is the beginning," I said. "Now I need a different kind of help. Can you make certified, notarized copies of these log pages and the deeds? And can you do it without creating a digital footprint?" Eleanor smiled for the first time that night. It was a thin, dangerous smile. "Sadie," she said, "watching a master at work is a pleasure. Leave it to me." I had the facts. I had the official corroboration, but I still needed a legal framework. I was a librarian, not a lawyer. Presenting this information in the wrong way could expose me to a lawsuit that would ruin me, even if I was right. I needed a guide through the minefield. I needed Mr. Davies. Arthur Davies was a retired attorney in his late 70s, a contemporary of Mr. Abernathy's and one of the few people who knew about his special project. He was a constitutional law expert who had spent his career fighting for historical preservation causes, often pro bono. He lived in a small house filled with more books than furniture. When I called him and told him what I was doing, his only question was, "What took you so long?" I spent a Sunday afternoon at his house, laying out the documents on his vast dining room table. He looked them over, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He peered at Abernathy's annotations through a loupe, a small, appreciative smile on his face. "Elias was a poet," he murmured. "A poet of indictment. He confirmed my worst fears and my greatest hopes. Yes, Richard will try to sue you into the Stone Age," he said, tapping a finger on one of the forged deeds. "He'll claim defamation, libel, everything. But he will lose. The truth is an absolute defense, Sadie, and you don't just have the truth, you have proof. Provable, documented, officially stamped proof." He then gave me the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. "The genius of what Elias did here," he explained, "is that he's not just documenting a moral crime, he's documenting a legal one with ongoing consequences. The Thompson Reservoir Authority, which the family still controls, generates millions of dollars a year from water rights and power generation. That entire enterprise is legally predicated on the legitimacy of these land transfers. If these deeds are proven to be fraudulent, the entire legal foundation of the Thompson family's wealth and power evaporates. It was a kill switch, a hidden leverage point that could bring the whole corrupt edifice crashing down. But Mr. Davies gave me a stern warning. "You cannot be the accuser," he said, looking at me over the top of his reading glasses. "If you stand up and shout thief, you become the story. You become the disgruntled librarian he will paint you as. You must simply present the facts. You are not an activist, you are an auditor. You are completing the task you were assigned. You must be calm, professional, and surgically precise. You must let the facts speak for themselves." My plan solidified. It wasn't a secret plan anymore. It was a battle plan. I wasn't just compiling a report. I was preparing a testimony, a eulogy for a drowned town, and an indictment of the family that had held a knife to its throat. The final piece fell into place almost by accident. I was doing a final cross-reference check in Abernathy's index, tracing a particularly complex chain of annotations related to the final holdout in Miller's Hollow, a farmer named Samuel Gable. Abernathy's code led me to an obscure book on local church histories. Tucked inside the back cover, in a flat pocket I had never noticed before, was a thin, folded envelope. My heart hammered against my ribs. Inside was a single yellowed sheet of paper. It was an affidavit, a sworn, signed statement from a woman named Clara Peterson, who had worked as a secretary for Jedediah Thompson's lawyer. It was dated 1955, years after the fact. In it, she confessed to seeing Jedediah and his lawyer practicing the county clerk's signature for hours. She described how they used a light box to trace it onto the blank deeds the farmers had been forced to sign. It was a deathbed confession she had mailed to Mr. Banathy for safekeeping, begging him to see that the truth came out one day. This was it, the eyewitness, the smoking gun. It wasn't just circumstantial evidence anymore. It was a voice from the grave, telling the whole sordid story. I held the paper in my hands, a document that had waited in the dark for nearly 70 years. Waited for a man like Richard Thompson to get arrogant enough to demand a look into the shadows. He wanted a full audit of the library's most valuable assets. I looked at the affidavit. This, I thought, was arguably the most valuable thing we owned, and I was going to deliver it directly to his desk, in front of the whole town. The deadline for the audit was 2 weeks away. It was to be presented at a specially convened town council meeting. The mayor had framed it as a moment of transparency, a public reckoning with the library's finances. In reality, it was a show trial, my trial. The local newspaper had already run a front-page story with a quote from Thompson about the need to make tough choices to modernize our town's services. The stage was set for my public execution. I spent those 2 weeks in a state of hyper-focused calm. I barely slept. I lived on stale coffee and adrenaline. During the day, I was librarian Sadie, helping patrons, running Storytime for the toddlers, managing my worried staff with a placid reassurance I did not feel. I told them to have faith, that we were more than just a building. They looked at me with a mixture of hope and pity. At night, the library became my war room. With Eleanor's discreet help, I had official, certified copies of everything: the fraudulent deeds, the notary's logbook that gave him his alibi, the State Water Commission charter, and Clara Peterson's explosive affidavit. Mr. Davies had reviewed every page, helping me organize it into a coherent, legally unassailable narrative. He advised me to structure my presentation not as an accusation, but as a journey of discovery. I was just the humble narrator, following the evidence. The final report was a masterpiece of misdirection. It was 150 pages long. The first 140 were exactly what Thompson expected: a mind-numbing inventory of assets, shelf by shelf, box by box. I included depreciation schedules, maintenance logs for the climate control system, and a detailed analysis of our insurance policies. It was designed to be so stupefyingly boring that it would lull him and his cronies on the council into a state of smug complacency. The real report was in the final 10 pages, the appendix, titled simply, Appendix A, Provenance Verification of Key Archival Holdings. The night of the meeting, the town hall was packed. It felt like the whole of Oakhaven was there. The local news channel had a camera set up in the back. Thompson sat at the head of the council table, looking imperious and confident. He gave me a condescending nod as I walked to the podium, a thick binder in my hands. He thought it was the text of my surrender. I started slowly, my voice calm and even. For 20 minutes, I walked them through the mundane details of the audit. I talked about the rising cost of acid-free storage boxes. I discussed the humidity levels in the vault. I saw Thompson share a smirk with his deputy. A few people in the audience started to fidget. I was boring them to death, just as planned. Then, I turned a page. This concludes the primary inventory portion of the audit, I said, my voice not changing in tone. As per the mayor's directive for a full and comprehensive review, the audit also required a thorough verification of the provenance of our most significant historical assets. This process focused on the collection of documents pertaining to the 1929 Oakhaven Land Grant and Reservoir Act. I saw a flicker of something in Thompson's eyes, not panic, just attention. He leaned forward slightly. Our archives, as it turns out, are more than just a collection of documents, I continued, my eyes scanning the room. They contain a parallel narrative, a system of annotation left by my predecessor, Mr. Elias Abernathy, which he called the Grammar of Truth. I began to click through a slide presentation I had prepared. The first slide was a high-resolution image of one of the Miller's Hollow deeds. It looked perfectly normal. On the surface, I said, the record is clear. 30 families willingly sold their properties to make way for a project for the public good. I clicked again. The image zoomed in on the margin, and a circle appeared around a tiny, almost invisible glyph. However, Mr. Abernathy's grammar provides additional context. This symbol, when cross-referenced with his index, indicates a transaction completed under duress. A murmur went through the council. Thompson's face was a mask, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his pen. I kept going, my voice a steady, academic monotone. I was a librarian, presenting a research paper. I showed the UV light analysis of the ink. I explained the cobalt compound forgery. I showed the side-by-side comparison of the real county clerk signature from other documents and the forgeries on the deeds. With each slide, the story built. I wasn't accusing anyone. I was just reading the notes in the margins. Then, I put up the page from the notary's logbook, the certified copy provided by Eleanor. The official county log, I stated, shows that the notarizing clerk, Mr. Henderson, was in fact giving testimony at the state capitol on the day he supposedly witnessed and stamped all 30 of these deeds in Oakhaven. A gasp rippled through the audience. Thompson shot a furious look at the town attorney, who just shrugged, his face pale. The deputy mayor was frantically whispering into his phone. The carefully constructed facade of the meeting was cracking. Thompson finally found his voice. He banged his gavel, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "Miss Miller," he boomed, his voice tight with fury, "this is outrageous. You were tasked with a financial audit, not to present some wild conspiracy theory based on the scribbles of a long-dead disgruntled employee." The room fell silent. Everyone looked at me. This was the moment, the pivot. I took a deep breath. "I agree, Mr. Mayor," I said calmly. "Unverified scribbles would be inappropriate, which is why the final piece of the audit is not a scribble." I clicked to the final slide. On the giant screen behind the council, a high-resolution image of Clara Peterson's affidavit appeared, every word clear and legible. "This is a sworn, notarized affidavit from Clara Peterson, dated 1955, I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even me. "In it, she provides a first-hand eyewitness account of your great-grandfather, Jedediah Thompson, and his legal counsel, practicing the forgery of the clerk's signature for the Miller's Hollow deeds." I let the image hang in the air for a long moment. You could have heard a pin drop. Thompson's face had gone from red to a ghastly, waxy white. He looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I closed my binder. "The audit you requested is complete, Mr. Mayor," I said, looking directly at him. His powerful, intimidating mask was gone. In its place was a scared, cornered man. "A full copy of my report and all supporting certified documents have been delivered to the members of the council, the Oakhaven Gazette, and as per standard procedure for findings of this nature, the State Attorney General's office. All materials are now a matter of public record, as per your directive." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point a finger. I didn't have to. I had simply done my job. I had performed the audit. The silent takeover was complete. The truth, which had been sleeping in my basement for 70 years, was now wide awake, and it was hungry. The aftermath was not a single explosion, but a series of controlled demolitions that brought the house of Thompson down, brick by brick. The power shift was immediate and brutal. The next morning, the Oakhaven Gazette, a paper that had dutifully printed the mayor's self-congratulatory press releases for years, ran a banner headline, "Archives Reveal Thompson Fortune Built on Quiet Thefts." The story, complete with images of the forged deeds and excerpts from the affidavit, was devastating. The reporter who had been at the meeting had worked through the night, and his story was a factual, step-by-step account of my presentation. He didn't paint me as a hero or a vengeful librarian. He painted me as what I was, a professional who had uncovered facts. It was far more damning. By mid-morning, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. The State Attorney General's office issued a formal statement confirming they had received my report and were opening a full investigation into the historical land transfers and the ongoing financial activities of the Thompson Reservoir Authority. The mayor's power, which had always seemed as solid and permanent as the dam his great-grandfather had built, began to crumble. The first exodus was not of clients but of allies. Two of the town council members who had been his staunchest supporters released a joint statement expressing their profound shock and disturbance at the findings and calling for the mayor to take a leave of absence pending the investigation. It was political jargon for "you're toxic and we're cutting you loose." Eleanor called me, her voice buzzing with a kind of grim satisfaction. She said the phones at town hall were ringing off the hook. The mayor was locked in his office and wasn't speaking to anyone. The rats were finally deserting the sinking ship. The most powerful shift came from the community itself. People started talking. Old stories, long dismissed as bitter gossip, were suddenly being re-examined. Descendants of the Miller's Hollow families, many of whom still lived in Oakhaven, began to come forward. An elderly woman whose grandfather was one of the displaced farmers gave a tearful interview to the local news, saying my report confirmed what her family had known in their bones for generations. The library, once on the chopping block, was suddenly transformed into a symbol of the town's conscience. We had an influx of visitors, people who just wanted to walk through the doors, to touch the place where the truth had been kept safe. Mayor Thompson, cornered and bleeding political capital, finally attempted his desperate counter. It came not as a public roar, but as a private, pleading whimper. He called my personal cell phone 2 days after the meeting. I almost didn't answer, but my curiosity, and a little bit of cruelty, got the better of me. His voice was unrecognizable. The booming, arrogant baritone was gone, replaced by a strained, hoarse whisper. "Sadie," he began, and the use of my first name was so jarring, so false, that I almost laughed. "Sadie, we can fix this. There's been a terrible misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of old documents." I said nothing. I just let the silence stretch. A tactic I had learned from Mr. Abernathy. Let the other person fill the void. They almost always fill it with their own desperation. "Look," he stammered, "I am prepared to offer the library a new deal, a legacy fund. We'll name a wing after you. 10 years of full, unconditional funding. Guaranteed. No more budget fights. You'll have everything you need. All you have to do is release a statement, a clarification, say that your findings were preliminary, that new information has come to light that puts the historical context in a different perspective." He was offering me a bribe, the very thing I had been fighting for. The library's security was being dangled in front of me as hush money. The irony was so thick I could taste it. He still thought he could buy the truth. He still thought I had a price. "Is that all, Mr. Mayor?" I asked, my voice as cool and dry as the air in the vault. The question seemed to break him. The false composure vanished, replaced by raw, ugly panic. "What do you want?" he snarled. "Is this about money? I'll write you a check. Right now. Name your price. Everyone has a price." "It wasn't about revenge, Mr. Mayor," I said softly, using the phrase that had become a mantra for me. "And it's certainly not about money. It was about the audit. The audit you requested. The audit is complete." And I hung up. I blocked his number. That was the last time I ever spoke to him. His desperate attempt to regain control had failed because he could not comprehend a motive that wasn't rooted in greed or power. He was trying to play chess, but I had already dismantled the board. The final act of his professional life was a pathetic spectacle. He was forced to call an emergency town council meeting the following week. The official purpose was to address the recent allegations. I attended. I didn't have to, but I wanted to see it. I sat in the front row, right where he had looked down on me just a week before. I wore a simple black dress. I brought a book with me, though I never opened it. It was just a prop, a symbol. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at his prepared statement, his hands trembling so badly the paper rattled. He was a ghost in his own office, a hollowed-out man who had lost the entire world and didn't understand how. He read his statement in a monotone, announcing his immediate and indefinite leave of absence, citing the best interests of the town. He mumbled something about cooperating fully with the Attorney General's investigation. Then he stood up, and without looking at anyone, walked out of the room, followed by the flash of a single news camera. He was gone. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. There was no shouting, no final, clever retort from me. His downfall was quiet, procedural, and absolute. He was a victim of his own hubris, crushed by the weight of a history he had foolishly provoked. The vindication wasn't in his fall, it was in what rose up in its place. The interim mayor, a quiet councilwoman named Sarah Jenkins, who had always voted in favor of the library, immediately took the floor. Her first act was to table a motion. It wasn't just to restore our funding, it was to triple the archive's budget and to formally declare the Oakhaven Public Library and its historical collection a protected town heritage site, shielding it from future political attacks. The motion passed unanimously, to a standing ovation from the crowd. In that moment, I felt it. The power shift wasn't just about the mayor's career, it was about the town's soul. The library was no longer a liability. It was our anchor, a place of strength. My new throne was the same old chair at the same old desk in the library director's office, but everything felt different. The light coming through the tall windows seemed brighter. The familiar smell of books felt less like dust and more like potential. My staff, who had been walking on eggshells for a year, were now buzzing with energy and ideas. Volunteers were signing up. The high school history teacher called to ask if I could design a curriculum for his students based on the Miller's Hollow discovery. The library was alive. The real victory came a few months later. The Thompson family, facing a mountain of legal trouble and public disgrace, agreed to a massive settlement. They were forced to cede hundreds of acres of their estate, the very land stolen from the people of Miller's Hollow, to a newly formed community land trust managed by the descendants of those families. They were also required to fund the construction of a new museum and cultural center dedicated to the history of the drowned town. Its location, a new wing of the Oakhaven Public Library. It was to be named the Elias Abernathy Wing. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. But sitting at my desk, looking at the architectural blueprints for the new wing, I felt a deep, profound, and undeniable sense of satisfaction. It was the quiet, steady hum of justice, the feeling of a record being set straight, of a story, long silenced, finally being told in a clear, strong voice. A few weeks ago, the first piece of the new exhibit arrived. It was a simple framed document that I had requested personally. I hung it on the wall of my office, right across from my desk, where I can see it every day. It's the original, coded page from Mr. Abernathy's ledger, the one that started it all. It's a mess of elegant script and cryptic symbols, a language only he and I could ever truly understand. To anyone else, it's just an old piece of paper. To me, it's a monument. It's a reminder that the most powerful truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to care enough to look. They say history is written by the victors, but I've learned that's not quite right. History is written by everyone. It's preserved by the librarians. It's remembered by the people who refuse to forget. There will always be men like Richard Thompson, men with loud voices and deep pockets, who will try to tell you that knowledge is a liability, that the past is irrelevant, that a library is just a quiet room full of dead trees. What they're really afraid of is not the paper, but the truth recorded on it. They are terrified of a story that is not their own, because a budget can be cut, a building can be closed, and a staff can be fired. But a fact, once it is discovered and shared, is permanent. It has a power that no amount of money or influence can ever truly silence. So if you believe in the power of that truth, and in the quiet strength it takes to stand up to the bullies who want to rewrite the world for their own selfish gain, do me a favor and like this video. It lets the algorithm know that stories like this matter. Leave a comment and tell me about a time you had to defend something you believed in, no matter how small. Share this story with anyone you know who has ever been made to feel like their work, their passion, is worthless. And please, hit that subscribe button and the little notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. It truly helps more than you know. Thank you for listening.